The second part of this lecture engages with feminist theory and its critique of the reason-emotion divide. This lecture is a very crude overview of the implication of the reason-emotion binary for the legal status of women and other marginalized groups in Western history. Feminist critiques has long problematized the reason-emotion binary. Recognizing the perspective dimensions of reason-emotion dualism, feminist thinkers have been exploring its consequences for the lived experience of different groups of people, their legal status, and their rights. To engage with some of the ideas of feminist critiques and the inequalities they criticize, this lecture surveys a very crude overview of some examples of the feminist critique of the reason-emotion binary through different historical periods. It is important to stress that feminist theory is extremely diverse. It makes more sense to talk about feminisms than about feminism. While diverse feminist theories share the idea that women are not naturally inferior to men and a desire for happier society, feminisms cover a vast range of theoretical ideas, activisms, and points of view. The overview covered in this lecture is by no means exhaustive. Rather, it attempts to present some ideas that illustrate how concepts like reason-emotion binary shape our shared reality and the law. Reason-emotion dualism can be traced back to ancient Greece. One example is Plato's allegory of the chariot pulled by two horses. In this allegory, the charioteer driving the chariot represents intellect or reason. One horse represents rational or moral impulse, or the positive part of passionate nature, while the other horse represents the soul's irrational passions. The charioteer is responsible for balancing these conflicting impulses and striking harmony between the two horses. While a distinction between reason and emotion is made, their interdependence is nevertheless stressed. When it comes to classifying human beings on the basis of reason, Plato described women as inferior to men in both reason and virtue. Nevertheless, Plato allowed for the possibility of a philosopher queen in his ideal republic. Aristotle's best state, on the other hand, explicitly excluded women and menial workers due to their inferiority in reason. He defined women by their function for men, that is, reproduction, and described them as deformed versions of men. Nevertheless, he did acknowledge their humanity, while slaves of any sex were completely excluded from humanity in his philosophy. Like Plato, Aristotle did not exclude emotions from the practice of reasoning. Nevertheless, he famously defined law as reason free from passion. Feminist theorist Genevieve Lloyd, an important critique of the reason-emotion binary, considers Aristotle's philosophy as the cornerstone of the concept of reason and the male reason. Nevertheless, some feminist theories find inspiration in Aristotle's philosophy and seek to reappropriate and rearticulate his concept of reason in more inclusive ways. Like ancient Greece and its elitist democracy, the Enlightenment is another fetishized era, celebrated as the epoch of reason, progress, equality, and human rights. Yet, the Enlightenment is also the epoch of colonialism, racialized slavery, and the creation of separate spheres for men and women. Purportedly universalist Enlightenment theories of equality and freedom, inspiring philosophical and political liberalism, have a very specific subject, a white man of property. For example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau preached equality but also believed that women are naturally inferior and incapable of reason and morality. He was strongly advocating different education for boys and girls. John Locke opposed slavery in his philosophy, but was involved in the slave trade and the institutional design of slavery in the American colonies. Immanuel Kant believed that women were incapable of reason and held that colonized people were inferior to white race and incapable of self-government. It is important to note that there were also exceptions, and some thinkers held the reason has no sex. Despite the hostile atmosphere, some women of higher social classes were participants in philosophy and sciences of the time. Mary Astro, for example, proposed that Descartes' formulation of reason isn't exclusively male and asked, if all men are born free, why are all women born slaves? Mary Wollstonecraft believed that women are not inferior in reason, but are victims of their socialization and poor education, and fiercely criticized Rousseau's view of the education of women and girls. She was also an ardent critique of the monarchy and social hierarchies in general. The philosophy of enlightenment and its emphasis on freedom and equality contributed to the tectonic changes in the social order. The Haitian Revolution of 1791 was a slave revolt that resulted in the first black state in the modern sense of the word in 1804. The Haitian Revolution might be seen as a response to the French Revolution of 1789 and its declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen. While celebrated as an important human rights document, the declaration allowed for social divisions based on social utility, for example, slavery in French colonies. Unlike the French and American revolutions, the Haitian Revolution was erased from historiography for roughly 200 years. Not only did the French and American revolutions declare equality of men without problematizing slavery, they also excluded women. Women were critical of such injustice. For example, Olympe de Gouges, a French feminist and abolitionist, responded to the omission of women in the French Declaration with an alternative declaration of the rights of women and the female citizen. She was later beheaded by the revolutionary government. North American women, who were overlooked by the founding fathers of the United States of America, responded with the Declaration of Sentiments. Declaration of Sentiments amended the phrase, all men are created equal, by adding, and women, decreed the illegitimacy of the patriarchal organization of society, addressed the oppression of women in private and public spheres, and urged for a truly democratic and equal society. By the late 19th century, separate spheres for women and men are firmly entrenched and considered the natural order of things. Men were perceived as belonging to the public political spheres as citizens and as sovereigns over the private spheres to which women were confined. Men were identified with reason, morality, activity, creativity, and culture, and were socialized not to show weakness, or, in other words, emotions. Women, on the other hand, were identified with emotion, immorality, passivity, and nature, and were socialized to be nurturing and caring wives and mothers, obedient to their fathers and husbands. Nevertheless, the feminist social theory existed at the time. It was mostly refuted as too emotional, too political, and too activist, since it demanded serious transformations of society and called attention to the problems of women, working class people, and people of color. Again, some exceptions to the general mindset of the era can be found. John Stuart Mill, for example, did not subscribe to the idea that women are inferior in reason. As a member of parliament, Mill introduced an unsuccessful amendment to substitute the word person in place of allegedly neutral man in legal texts. The 19th century was also marked by the Industrial Revolution. Despite the idea of women as homemakers, most women, men, and children worked grueling jobs, lived in poverty, and did not receive a meaningful education. Marxism, as a philosophical and social movement, addressed these issues and demanded a change. Yet Marx and Engels assumed women's reproductive work in the household as a given. Marxist feminists called attention to the double shift of women, composed of wage work outside and reproductive work inside the home. Some argued that women constitute a specific social class and call out the blind spot in traditional Marxist theory. Marxist feminists were important critics of industrial society, yet their contribution is often overlooked at the expense of liberal feminisms focused on the unequal legal rights of men and women. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the feminist movement was loudly resisting the status quo. Despite working, paying taxes, and bearing legal responsibilities, women were not allowed to vote. Thus, the suffragette movement's key demand was the right to vote. While the suffragette movement exposed many important issues, it was also wrought with internal contradictions, like the marginalization of women of color within the movement. The opposition to slavery was also growing at the time. Women, white and black, played an important role in the abolitionist movement. Though some women's rights activists held racist beliefs and some abolitionists sexist views. The relationship between the two emancipatory movements is thus very complicated. Women of color face overlapping discrimination and were at the bottom of social pyramid. A different set of stereotypes applied to women of color than to white women. Women of color were not considered as fragile and in need of protection, but as unruly creatures with an animalistic sexuality. For example, the former slave abolitionist and feminist activist Sojourner Truth is one of the most iconic voices of Black women to criticize the focus on the experience of white women as the universal experience of all women. She famously posted the question, "Ain't I a woman?" Intersectional feminism, addressing the overlapping markers of oppression, will only become a mainstream methodology 100 years after her death. The feminist movement described so far is usually described as first wave feminism. First wave feminists predominantly focused on demonstrating that differences between men and women are exaggerated and culturally produced. Their main objective was to prove that women are capable of reason and entitled to participation in the public sphere, for example, the right to vote and own property. Demands for legal equality were largely met by the 1960s and 70s, when a new wave of feminism splashed, commonly referred to as the second wave feminisms. Facing a variety of obstacles, many women realize that formal legal equality does not guarantee actual equality. Reproductive rights, gendered violence, sexual harassment and discrimination, economic disparities unpaid reproductive and emotional work, and many other issues prompt women to demand extensive changes in the law and society. The reason emotion binary is an important topos in the wave of feminism as well. Feminism is this era and are extremely diverse, and this lecture only touches on some of its strands and ideas. Radical feminism focused on sex, often considered a private and emotional matter, and exposed it as a very public issue. The slogan, "Private is political," indicates how sexual relations between men and women are a site of patriarchal power. For example, legal scholar Katrine McKinnon theorized law not as a neutral system of reason, but as a tool for the oppression of women. Radical feminisms importantly contributed to the criminalization of, for example, marital rape, sexual harassment, and gender discrimination. As asserted women were not only perceived as less rational, but also as less moral than men. Male researchers investigating the development of moral reasoning have been using all male samples to construct a scale of moral development. They concluded that women's moral development is inferior to the male. Carol Gilligan proposed a different explanation. The all-male samples only investigate the moral reasoning of men, without wondering if women's moral reasoning might be different without being inferior. Her research with mixed samples demonstrated that men and women are differently socialized and develop different strategies of moral reasoning. She distinguished between the justice perspective, typical for men, focused on individual rights, and the care perspective, typical for women, who tend to focus on relationships and compromise. She pointed out that men, too, operate within the care perspective, and that care perspective is far from inferior. Gilligan's sampling was criticized for mainly including white middle class subjects. Subsequent studies with more diverse samples revealed that men of color and lower social classes tend to rely more on the care perspective than privileged white men. Different strands of cultural feminism celebrate rather than deny the difference between women and men. Radical strands propose women's segregation, while more moderate versions propose that men might learn to adopt female virtues, contributing to a better society for everyone. Legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw revolutionized feminist theory in the late 1980s by coining the term intersectionality. She problematized the way the law treats gender and race as two separate eventualities. The interplay of these factors, which is far more complicated than a simple sum of two types of discrimination, is thus overlooked, leaving women of color without legal protection in case where discrimination is rooted precisely in their overlapping identities. Intersectionality opened the space for women of color to contemplate their subject positions in social hierarchies. Intersectionality is not limited to gender and race, but is open to numerous markers of oppression, like sexuality or social class and their interlapping. Postcolonial feminists also exposed the many differences among women and criticized the idea conception of women as representing white, straight, middle class women who believe their experience is universal and exhaustive. Standpoint feminisms embrace differences and celebrate emotion as epistemologically valuable. For example, Donna Haraway refused the idea of a universal thinking subject and proposed a feminist objectivity, which does not pretend to be universal and all knowing. Ironically, the objectivity of science might be strengthened if the standpoint of the knower was seriously considered, she proposed. Alison Jagger concentrated on the epistemic value of outlaw emotions, the seemingly wrong emotional responses of the oppressed. She proposed that emotions and reason are hopelessly entangled, and that Western science tends to suppress emotions and hence remains blind to their contribution to the seemingly objective concepts it produces. One of the most influential theories of the 1990s is Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity. Butler took issue with the sex-gender distinction in feminist thought, attempting to both represent women and escape the narrative that women are defined by their biology. The concept of gender as a cultural interpretation of sexed bodies became prominent in feminist theory. Yet, Butler argued the sex-gender binary is no less problematic than other hierarchical oppositions. It presupposes biological sex as an immutable passive given on which gender is inscribed. Butler revolutionized feminists and queer theory by arguing that sex is a discursive phenomenon and that material sex bodies are created through numerous repetitions of sex gender norms. Currently, the humanities and social sciences are in the midst of the so-called effectual turn. This strand of theorizing is built upon a critique of the textual turn in a social sciences for neglecting the body and the material while focusing on subjectivity and representation, knowledge, discourse, epistemology, and culture. Effective turn focuses on the affect, emotions, feelings, and their intersections and complexities. Thinkers ascribe to the effectual turn are attempting to redefine these notions by exploring non-human agency and the effect, and challenging dualisms like nature-culture, human-non-human, mind-matter, and some such. Feminists and queer thinkers are important voices in the effectual turn, unsurprising considering the legacy of feminist thought interrogating the issues of the body and emotions as the realm traditionally identified with femininity. Effectual turn interrogates politics and ethics through an attempt to reconsider the notions of subjectivity and simplistic ways of understanding what emotions and affect are and how they operate across the social and material fields. This short lecture could not do justice to the complexities of feminist theories and their diverse analysis of the reason emotion divide. Many theories and theorists were not mentioned, and many social issues related to the reason emotion binary were not explored. Nevertheless, this rudimentary overview illustrates that the strict separation of reason and emotions served as a device to exclude groups of people deemed more emotional and hence less reasonable from the position of power and influence. While much progress has been made to achieve equality and address discrimination, the struggles of women, people of color, colonized, poor, and others are far from complete.